following podcast is a Jill Divine Media production.
Christianity has become known for judgy people, strange words, ancient stories, confusing rules, and a members-only mindset. This is why I stayed away from the church for so long, but it's not supposed to be that way. I'm Jill Divine, a former radio personality with 3 tattoos, a love for a good tequila, and who's never read the entire Bible. Yet, here I am, hosting a podcast about faith. The Normal Goes a Long Way podcast is your home for real conversations with real people using real language about how faith and real life intersect. Welcome to the conversation.
Welcome, Pastor Chuck Schley and Ryan Fendler. Welcome back.
Oh, thanks. It's always great to be with you, Jill. Wow. What a thrill to be part of the show, Graham, here at Normal Goes.
The show, Graham.
Is that like a old person commentation? No.
That's rude. That's rude. Don't call him old. He's not old.
Seasoned.
Veteran.
He's a veteran human.
We call it seasoned.
Seasoned experience.
Maybe.
Yes. Okay. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about, but we can. You're welcome. I love having you guys on. So in our previous episode, I had Pastor Jim Mueller on, and we talked about our storyteller sermon series that we did at Messiah. I always like to get you guys in to talk about some of the things that maybe you didn't get a chance to preach upon, or something that maybe I noticed that I had never, ever heard. And what we first talked about with Jim, parables. What is a parable? Explain in your own words.
I believe at the Messiah St. Charles confirmation class formerly taught by Pastor Chuck Schley, a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. How's that?
Yeah, that's pretty good for a basic. It's basically Jesus telling some story that normal people could relate to, but he's really talking about stuff that's invisible. So he's given a visible story about things that are invisible. He's really talking about the kingdom of God and spiritual stuff.
But a parable also happens in a world that we used the word before in previous conversations, a secular world, which means non-religious. I asked Pastor Jim if he ever grew up with a parable in the secular world, and he gave one. Do you guys have one?
First thought would be like Aesop's fables are usually, it's about a fox and some grapes and a mirror or whatever. And the point is, don't shove too much in your mouth, or be thankful for what you have.
Oh, you have one?
First one that comes to mind is the boy who cried wolf. That's a parable. Yeah. Kid complains about things that don't matter, and then when it does matter, he gets eaten by a wolf. So the lesson is, shut up.
Are you going to tell that one to your daughter right before bedtime?
Oh, I don't know. Speaking of, I don't think our audience knows that you are expecting a daughter in December.
Yeah, we are.
Okay, we'll have a separate combo about that.
Yeah, that's great.
All those judgy
Still
things.
Flipping coins over the name. So,
yeah.
Whatever you do, don't tell people at a time.
I agree.
Ruin it for you.
100% do not tell
It'll be
anyone.
Like, you come up with this great name. Let's just pick a name. Let's say Jill.
Yeah.
Okay. And then someone will say, "Oh, I knew a Jill, and she was the kid who always eat paste next."
Right. Or how are you going to spell it? Oh, you can't spell it like that because then
J-Y-L-L.
Yes, they won't know.
The number 7, the letter Q.
So, yeah, that's a whole nother thing. Let's go back to our parables. Parables. So, what would you say are the most known parables in the Bible?
Ooh, what would you say?
I would say the lost sheep one. Is that one?
Good one.
Yep. And then the coins. Is it gold coins?
Yeah, they're great.
Okay. Those.
And then the follow-up. So Jesus tells that story about the lost sheep, then about the lost coins. Then he comes in with the big daddy of them all, which is the parable of
The prodigal son?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we're not going to go into those.
Okay.
We can have individuals do that.
The Good Samaritan.
Oh, yes. Pastor Jim brought that one up. Okay. So you guys decided as a team, we're going to talk about the lesser known parables. And what I have written down for each of yours, Ryan, you taught on the workers in the vineyard. Chuck, you taught on the narrow door and the great banquet. I will tell you, Chuck, the great banquet, man, that was so great.
More.
Let me tell you why.
This isn't my story. I'm just telling Jesus.
I know, but that's what's so cool that you guys are the storytellers too. And what's wonderful is what you guys are, however you prep, praying beforehand, asking the Holy Spirit to come in, and whatever words that come to you, somebody is going to take something different from each message. It's going to hit somebody in a different way. One sentence can be one thing to one. So for me, with the great banquet, and just talking about that one, when you described, I had no idea that these excuses, which you can talk about what it is, but these excuses were so rude and outlandish, and then you compared them. So can we go with that first?
I'm fully on board with what you said about how story or message, sermon can hit people differently, because that always surprises me.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I'll finish up and it works both ways, and I'll go, man, sorry, but that was awesome. Not bragging, just saying it was good. And I look out there and I get like, it looks like an oil painting. It's like, hey, wake up. This is... And then other times when I'm like, oh, what a clunker that was. Ooh, Chuck. And somebody come up to me with tears in their eyes going, you were talking to me. And I'm like, really?
Jim said the exact same thing.
Fascinating. The word
Mhm.
of God.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, back to your question now. Sorry.
But no, that's okay. I'm glad you said those things.
Yeah, but that's what hit me right away. That, you know what? God's word is powerful and it's active, and preacher can be good, bad, or otherwise, but some will get some stuff done through it
Mm-hmm.
because the word works. The word works.
Well, and you guys work too. So, I mean, just, yeah.
Okay, so my prep is definitely pray beforehand.
Okay.
And here's my prayer. Holy Spirit, I got nothing. I am out. I don't even know what to say anymore. I've said it all before, and I've got nothing new. I don't have a creative bone in my body. Help me, help me, help me. Let's go. That's basically the prayer.
And then you just start writing?
No, I start looking up. First, I spend a little time reading what I'm supposed to be preaching on a few times. But then I go to people who are smarter than me. And I pull out, let's say it was on the parable of the great banquet. I will go to my library and read everything that anybody has ever said about the parable of the great banquet and basically steal their good stuff. And hopefully I quote them and give them credit. But I'm just looking for an idea. I'm looking for a way to connect it to real life. And, I think and Ryan, you're really a great preacher already, dude.
Yeah.
And Jim's awesome. And I think what we try to do is we realize this might be our one shot at people. So let's not go through the motions. Let's not assume everyone knows what we're talking about. Let's hopefully do our best so that God can do good stuff through it.
When prepping for the great banquet, did you feel, because you guys are trained, you are educated, you know stuff a little bit more than the average Joe, but did you feel like you had a great understanding of it before you started to preach on it?
The basics of it, sure. The basics, I think a child could get it, that Jesus invites people and they come up with excuses and they miss out. Okay, on that very basic.
Right.
Yes. But then I go to, and they have these wonderful books called commentaries, where people smarter than I am have dissected every word of that parable and pull all kinds of stuff out of it. And half the time it's over my head. But my job, I think, is to take what these geniuses have said and apply it to regular people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, okay, so when I first got out of the seminary, I did a whole Bible study. I don't know what it was on. And, I was just wowing people with my genius. And at the end of it, I'll never forget it. This was really helpful. At the end of it, this dear woman asked me a question. I said, any questions? And her question was, who is this St. Paul guy you keep talking about? I went, oh no, shoot. I've been talking past you and over you. And, ooh, Chuck, it's like, man, that opened my eyes quite a bit.
And I think if I were to put myself in her shoes, that was probably a really brave, bold thing for her to ask.
Oh, yeah. But it's sincere. She was like,
right.
who's the St. Paul guy you keep talking about? I'm like, oh, wow.
And we need that.
Could you come back next week?
Yeah. How about we have coffee? We'll talk.
Yeah, I just missed the whole boat. I didn't even set it up. I just yakety yak, yak, yak.
Would you explain the Great Banquet, the three excuses, and the comparison you did for what our excuses would be today?
Yeah, and so I just want to give credit to this guy, Ken Bailey. Ken Bailey, he wrote this really thick book, and he lived in the Middle East for years and years and years, and he knew his Greek language and Aramaic and the stuff where the Bible, that's the language of the original text of the Bible, and he knows this stuff up and down. And so I got my stuff from him.
Okay.
So when I read that, I'm like, oh, snap, I've got to
yeah.
people what this is like. And then I made up my own excuse. I didn't use him word for word.
Okay.
He had more kind of fancy language.
Right.
And I just said, when these guys said, I have to try out my oxen, I have to buy this piece of property. He gave the background, like nobody in the Middle East just buys property. You go through this year-long process to see if it rains, how does the water work, is the soil good, does it grow anything? Because if you buy the wrong piece of property, you die. So nobody just goes out one day and buys property. And I said, oh, it's kind of like if you would go out just on a whim and buy a house.
Yeah.
And tell your wife, hey, I'm going to be late today because I'm buying a house and I want to see what kind of house I bought.
No,
it's bizarre. And that's what Jesus, and he always tells these extreme examples, the most weirdest examples. And so to his original audience, when he said, I have to go out and, look at this field I just bought, people would have lost their minds. They would have been like cracking up on that. Like, no, duh, nobody does that. Or I'm going to go try out this oxen that I just bought. No, they would have been like rolling on their side like, oh, come on, nobody does that. But we read that and go, okay, neat.
Yeah.
I'm going to go check out your field.
Or
The third one, of course, was the one that's a little dicey.
But I had no clue.
Just got married, so I can't come.
And I was like, oh, well, that makes sense because they're newlyweds and they've got to be together.
But Ken Bailey points out, like, the original language is, I'm going to be getting busy with a woman. And
we need to hear that.
yeah. So that's what I'm doing.
So that's what I'm saying is that when you read the Bible, we have to have all of these discussions. We have to know, like, again,
It just adds
yes,
flavor
to understand.
Salt to the meal.
What about you, Ryan? Were you pretty confident with the workers in the vineyard, or?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think some of the parables Jesus shares are timely and some of them are timeless. And Chuck, you have a very timely one, and like Jesus is using these examples. You have to read a book by a guy who lived in the Middle East for years to understand the kind of examples Jesus is sharing. Like, we can kind of conceptualize, okay, these people are making excuses, but you don't really get
How it's
severity.
yeah.
Right, because your whole point was, in our minds, we're not buying oxen and we're not buying fields.
No.
And so we're like, oh, okay, these are excuses.
It's,
Yeah.
Hey, you're having a Thanksgiving party. You did all the shopping, you did all the stuff, all the prep, and then it's time to eat. And people say, I got to go home and return a library book.
Right. So that's really cool.
Like, no,
Yeah.
no.
And I think that's fun in sermon prep to kind of say, okay, here's these weird examples I don't get. I have to read and dig into like the time and place that Jesus lived and the kind of story he's sharing. And okay, is this a good excuse or a bad excuse? So some parables you have to dig in like that to understand versus the workers in the vineyard. That's a timeless example of a person who works 8 hours and a person who works 1 hour gets paid the same. Even today, we get that that's not fair.
Exactly.
Like, you don't have to do a lot of translation there. People get, wait, there's one guy that shows up at the beginning of the workday and works all day, and he gets paid the same as a guy who works 1 hour on the clock. Like, no matter when you live, you get that something weird and different is going on here. And even in some senses, something unfair is going on.
Yes.
So I really like that.
But how do you take that into a 30-minute message?
So this one, what I try to think through is who's going to be the type of person that pushes back against this. And so there are some weeks that I think the pushback would come from maybe like a first-time person, an unchurched person showing up. They're going to hear this teaching from Jesus, and it's going to really challenge them. Workers in the vineyard is a challenge to the people who are in the church and who have been churched. And so I start off kind of by identifying, okay, what type of person is going to push back against what Jesus is saying here, and why would they push back? And what do they need to hear to trust that Jesus is saying something true and right that we should listen to and follow? So I guess I'm always thinking through my head, if I were to just on the spot share with you, Jesus shares this parable here, what would your first reaction or pushback be to it? So I'm trying to identify those pieces there. And I'm also thinking through, okay, like I've worked an hourly job before, so I've been in this situation. And so in my experience working an hourly job, like what was that experience like? Thinking through that. And one of the first interesting things I thought of is, just because you show up to work for 8 hours doesn't mean you're working 8 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just a funny, like, way of seeing it that I never thought of before, that these workers are obsessing over the hours that they've worked. I have worked enough hourly jobs, and I have been maybe the hourly worker who clocks in for 8 hours and conveniently takes a lot of breaks and goes to the back. And meanwhile, the person that shows up for 1 to 2 hours, they're doing a whole lot more than me. Thinking through that experience, I'm like, oh man, how many people have I met in the church who have been Christians their whole lives, been in the church their whole lives, and have been comfortable sitting in the back. And then you meet someone who gets to know Jesus at 50 or 60, and they are so passionate and on fire for the gospel that they can do way more in those last 10 to 20 years of their life than some of us do in 80 years of knowing Jesus. And so to me, that's the big challenge, is just because you've been here for a while doesn't necessarily mean, oh, I've done more than that person. I've done more than that person. And so what really happens in that parable is you see people playing the comparison game. And we all get the comparison game. Like, I've done more than them, therefore I deserve more than them. Or really what it means is, I've been here longer, which means that person deserves less than me. It's one way to think, I've been here longer, so I deserve more than someone else. When you realize what you're really saying is, I've been here longer, which means they deserve less than me. In the parable of the workers in the vineyard, what's happening is the people that have been around all day, have been working all day, think that those who have come to the field later deserve less than they do. To translate that to the church, it means someone like me who's been in the church my whole life thinks that someone who comes to know Jesus at 50s is somehow less deserving of the rewards of Jesus than I am. And that's the real challenge there, I think, to us lifelong Christians, to say if you give into this kind of mindset that you deserve more because you've been here longer, what you're saying is somehow that 50-year-old that comes to know Jesus later in life doesn't deserve the full reward that Jesus won for them. And really, it's Jesus's reward and payment to give to begin with. So it's not up to us to decide who deserves it and who doesn't. And I think, truthfully, Jesus' reward was generous for all of us. And so none of us, right? I think I dug into Romans 5. All of us are sinners and fall short of the glory of God. All of us, even those lifelong Christians, which means everything we get from Jesus is generous. And so, that's kind of the end of the passage, is the master is like, are you angry at my generosity? Almost like those first hour workers are forgetting that master was generous, that the worker was generous with them. So that's kind of the process that I went through for this, is what would someone, when they hear this message about the parable of the workers in the vineyard, what's going to challenge them? What's their pushback? And so for this one, the pushback point was, if I'm a lifelong Christian, don't I deserve more?
All right. Well, what about the narrow door? That was the very first one of our series, right? Wasn't it?
I think it was.
Yeah.
I think it was. Yeah. And I basically told a story about how I was on a field trip with my daughter, and a little stressed about when the tour guide said, coming up to Fat Man's Misery, and my daughter looked at me like, I know, Dad, and I'm like, shut up. I got this, but I was actually a little going, I don't know about this. And just as a way of introducing Jesus was talking about, and how that little story that Jesus tells should wake us up a little bit. And it naturally does, when he says, only a few are going to be able to fit through. He's talking about, the door to heaven. And all of a sudden we go, okay. We start questioning, am I going to make it? And maybe it gets us a little worried, until you realize he is the door, and just follow him. You're in good hands.
Any final thoughts on these lesser known parables?
We could have done this for 5 months.
Well, yeah, that's the question. How many more would you have taught on?
I would have done it on 5 for sure, personally. But you do start to pick up similar themes. Sometimes the parables, he's talking about money again. He's got like 5 or 6 that are about, put your hope in money.
But that goes back to what I said at the beginning, is one parable might not hit someone, but that other parable, which has the same meanings, hits another person. So it's like, why not teach on those?
Some of those parables don't get answered at the end. Like, they don't get resolved. Like, many times he just leaves the story hanging. You go, well, now what?
What happens next?
What happens next is, what happens to you? How do you read it? Does this make any difference to you at all? So you get to, let's say that you have the 3 parables in a row with Luke 15. You mentioned the lost sheep and the lost coin. That one, I did that one, which we were doing lesser ones. But I wouldn't talk about lost coins. I talk about lost credit cards. Then we go, oh, yeah.
Right.
That's a big deal.
Oh, that's a huge deal. Right.
A lost coin, we're like, yeah, what's a big deal? So what?
Yeah.
Well, what if you lose your car keys? Or, all of a sudden you are really sweeping the house and looking around going, where's my stupid car keys? Where's my car? And when you find it, you're like, woohoo!
Right.
And the point is, that's the Father's reaction when somebody comes to him. He goes, woohoo! Awesome. We got a celebrating party. And then you get to the parable of the prodigal son. You got the son who wanders off, okay, and he comes home. And then you got the older brother who represents the religious types. And then the father goes out to him, to the older son, and says, hey, come on into the party. We got to go celebrate. The end. And we don't know. Does he go in and celebrate? Does he not? Does he stay outside? What happens?
It's a Christopher Nolan movie.
It's
The ending's up to your interpretation. Oh.
Oh.
The question kind of turns to you.
What would you do?
We're going to go on and celebrate?
Are we going to mend? Mm-hmm.
Crap.
Yeah.
Mic drop.
Yeah. I like this because even I got, full disclosure, I think Jim, Parable of the Fig Tree, was the least known of the whole.
Yeah.
Because, full disclosure, he says, hey, I'm doing the Parable of the Fig Tree. Now, there's 2 fig tree moments with Jesus. There's one where he curses a fig tree, and then there's the Parable of the Fig Tree. And so Jim says, I'm doing the fig tree one. And I'm like, oh, where Jesus curses the fig tree? And he goes, no, the Parable of the Fig Tree. I'm like, oh, yeah, right, Parable of the Fig Tree. And I walk out of the room and I Google, what's the Parable of the Fig Tree? I said, sure, that one. That's a good one. So even I was like, wow, because it's such a short one. And because it's so short and kind of happens right, it's in Luke. It's never even been one in my mind that I would think of as this is a parable, but it is a parable. So I loved it for that reason. I'm like, oh, shoot, I learned something.
And the punchline of all these stories that Jesus tells is they're really outlandish for the first-time listener. The original listener, these were outlandish stories, and they're always upside down. It always caught people off guard. They'd never make sense. You get the shrewd manager, or, the guy gets busted for cheating, and he kind of gets rewarded for it. You're like, what? The workers in the vineyard, the guy works 1 hour, and he gets paid the same. You're like, what? And all these parables are like, at the end, you're like, what? He's like, yes, my kingdom is totally upside down. It does not work the way this world works, and it's much more fun. Follow me.
And I think I can't help but read it as a Christian. I'm like, this is all good news. These are all great stories that we all should agree with and think is great. But then like you said, you think back to those first hearers. I think a lot of them were actually really challenged by it, and some of them even turned off by it.
Oh, they wanted to kill him for it.
Yeah.
Pharisees, he's telling the story. Hey, I'm having a banquet, and guess what? You ain't coming. And they're like, excuse me?
Uh-huh.
What?
Yeah.
And then when he walked out, I'm like, they said, we got to kill this guy.
Yeah. So a deep dive, I didn't get into this because I'm not Jewish, so I don't think it would work. But I was thinking through mine with the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Jesus is talking about people who've borne the heat of the day all day long, and then you get these kind of last-minute workers coming at the end, and they get all the same reward. And I'm thinking, I wonder if he's also talking about when he brings the Gentiles into the church. And these Jewish people he's talking to have gone through centuries of suffering. They've had slavery, they've had exile, they've had suffering under foreign rulers. They've borne all these things as God's people. But they thought, man, I have the reward at the end. And then when Jesus comes in and welcomes the Gentiles, and I'm sure some of them felt like they get to come in for free when us and our people have suffered all this time for you, God. We hear, oh, the guy that comes in last minute, gets to go to heaven, gets saved for free. That's great. That's good news. But for those people, they're probably like, that was probably a little bit insulting. I bet they were angry to hear that, to think, what has this 2,000 years of suffering, 3,000 years of suffering been for? I thought we were the special people. And so, yeah, even in mine, you go back and look back at the original people hearing it, and it's like, oh, I could see them being frustrated at that.
Right, with the fig tree, the original, the symbol for Israel was the fig tree. And he's saying, if it ain't going to produce, I'm cutting it down.
Yeah.
I'm sure they went out of their minds. They're like, look at the rocks all of a sudden. Throw at this guy.
Yeah.
But, Jesus is tough.
Yeah.
We might look at these, don't look at them as cute little stories.
So
They are loaded and offensive.
I have to say this as listening to you guys and Jim, I could sit here, I'm like a kid, and I could sit here and listen to you guys talk as if you were there. I can see it in your minds. the way that you guys can tell these stories and these facts and these events. And I just sit here like, wow, like that's really cool. The passion and the way that you talk about it to where somebody who just has, still learning. I'm like, oh, wow.
Yeah, it's fun.
It's really cool to witness. And I'm just like, it doesn't matter. I visualize what we have in our family room where the kids go. And it's a picture of Jesus with all the kids like pulling on him. And then some of them are sitting and he's reading. And like, you don't have to be a kid to be doing that. Like, I feel that way right now, listening to the way you guys, like you were there, like, what happened. That's cool.
It is cool. But never forget, they pay us money to sit in our offices and read and learn and somehow communicate.
Well, I appreciate that.
And don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Normal Goes a Long Way. You can also head to normalgoesalongway.com and feel free to contact any of us. All of our contact information is there, and we would love to hear from you. And if you have a topic or a guest that you think that we should tackle, please let us know. Again, all of our contact information is at normalgoesalongway.com.